I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. Hello lovelies. I've been on a few podcasts and things recently that like to get a feel for who you are when you talk about your work and so on, or where you are politically and whatever else. So it has me in a thoughtful and reflective mood. It's also my birthday on the 5th, which tends to make one reflective on one's life as one gets older. And it's also the 20th anniversary of the release of the Munchkin's Guide to Powergaming, if the information I can find online is correct. Personally, I'm not too sure, but it seems about right. I know we wrote it through 99, I think, into 2000. So it being released at the end of 2000 would make sense after editing and everything else. So it seems like a good moment to take stock, I guess. I first got my start in gaming through fighting fantasy game books, really. I still have a bunch in my shelf. Nothing particularly handy, but Tunnels and Trolls is. Also solo game books, though I didn't stumble into them till a lot later. So a friend of mine, Russell, was an absolute fanatic for fighting fantasy books, and I was an absolute fanatic for science fiction and fantasy and all those kind of things. So it made sense that we would trade the books back and forth, and that we would play through them together. One of us would read, the other would play, or the other way around. And then we got the advanced fighting fantasy book, which had a dungeon in it. I can still remember aspects of that, like the shopkeeper. And we would play through that, and then the idea was that you could then create your own adventures, and between Titan and Out of the Pit that was pretty easy, but it was somewhat unsatisfying in terms of a rules system. And we never got onto the really sort of advanced fighting fantasy, which had more expanded rules. But we did start to stumble into other games. My first proper RPG was MERP, Middle-earth Role-Playing, which was by Iron Crown Enterprises and used a slightly stripped-down version of Rolemaster. So as initiations into role-playing proper go, that was pretty much being thrown in at the deep end. My dad took me to a model shop in Basingstoke that no longer exists. The little square where it was no longer exists, was built over by a mall. And there I bought MERP and Battle Cars. Those are my two sort of first games. Battle Cars being a Games Workshop rip-off of Car Wars, basically, but with some slightly more elegant and accessible rules, I think, and a lot of cardboard chits for recording damage and that sort of thing. I still got them somewhere, both, though the box for MERP long ago fell apart. And that was my start, really. That's how I got into it. And then bought a few MERP scenarios from a model/gaming shop in Southampton, which was right by the multi-storey car park, but I don't know whether that still exists. Got my first miniatures there. I think the first set of miniatures I ever bought was a Lord of the Rings set, because I've always been into that, and I live in the kind of countryside that is depicted in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. So yeah, that made sense. I think I got some Chaos Dwarves before I even knew what Warhammer was as well. I do remember getting Warhammer 40,000 and reading it while Sade played on the CD player. Yeah, it's weird how memories get tied together like that. But that was a big deal as well, especially as my friends were into Warhammer, particularly Warhammer 40,000, from a quite young age. I was never as good at painting miniatures, and even though miniatures were cheaper back then and you got more of them for the money, it was still a bit too much of an expensive hobby for me. I was more interested in books and role-playing games. So that's kind of how I got my start, and then I made a few of my own choose your own adventure books in some big sort of blotter pads that I had from my grandmother. One was just a straightforward fantasy thing. There was a lot of stuff to do with an orc toilet in one of the ones that I wrote, and the other one was a kind of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sort of rip-off. But then I began writing my own scenarios for normal games or improvising. I've always been a very improvisational games master, more than someone who wrote things down necessarily. But nonetheless, I picked up the skills there. Once I got to secondary school, I began writing my own games. I think the first game I ever sold was a handwritten, very simplistic RPG based on the Captain Power TV series to a friend of mine. He bought it for £12.50 in what must have been 1988, 1989. So you have a very unique RPG out there, Ian. If you still have it, might be worth something now. Or when I die, it'll definitely be worth something, I'm sure. And I started running a fanzine, which my dad would photocopy on the sly at work for me. I had a readership of about 20 to 25 people. So not that much smaller than my YouTube channel, really, all things considered. And that was an interesting experience, putting that together, having something you've written come together as a magazine, putting it all together, stapling it, selling it. Yeah, that was interesting, and that kind of led into briefly doing a fanzine for some play-by-email games. And then once I went on to college, I was heavily involved in the college magazine, doing cartoons and editorials. Pretty much, if you know what I'm like today, you know the kind of thing that I did. I remember an editorial lambasting vegans, which is timeless, of course, and a cartoon about a whole bunch of identical kids going to see that sort of folky pop/punk band that was really big at the time. What's their song? There's only one way of life, and that's your own. So the irony of a bunch of identical looking people at one of those gigs, that's the kind of thing that tickled my fancy back then. Levelers, there you go. Levelers, they were massively popular at the time, probably in part due to the road protests and so on that were also going on at the same time. So I told you this was going to be a rough and ready video, so very little preparation, which is why I'm loudly, clatteringly typing as I talk. So yeah, I did that. I went on to art college. Not entirely a waste of time, but something of a waste of time. But all the best people are art school dropouts, so why not? In the early 90s, I started on Vampire LARP. Started out by running my own games and hosting them at village halls and so on, because my tabletop group had gotten so massive that it was basically impractical to run tabletop games at the time. I think I had 30 regular players at one point. It was just absurd. And I started to think, maybe I'm good at this. Maybe I can do something more with this. And definitely being part of the LARP Society did give me an opportunity to hone those skills, and my improvisational ability came in a lot there. Unfortunately, that was also my introduction to a lot of the politics in gaming, because there was a very strong PC undercurrent in a lot of that, even during the 90s. That was our previous sort of peak. and also a lot of politicking and cheating and manipulations of the system, and people getting into positions of power within the International LARP Society that shouldn't. It's very disappointing. I finally gave up on it around 2005. I don't regret my time there. It taught me some useful skills and some useful lessons, and was very good for networking, and I met my partner there, so, you know, it's alright. So that was from about 95 till around 2005 that I was involved in that. The Munchkin's Guide came together around 98, 99. See, we were kind of out of school, out of education, were looking for work at the time, me and my mate Steve, and we thought, oh, we'll give this RPG writing thing a go. So we made a big list of ideas, and we fired them off to every single role-playing company we could find that had an email address, big or small. Got a couple of nibbles. We almost got tapped to develop a new version of Chill, but then the publisher went under, if I'm remembering my timeline correctly. But what we did get was an opportunity from Steve Jackson Games to write something we had only really put on there as a laugh, which was the Munchkin's Guide to Powergaming, which was our idea for a sort of comedy book about role-playing, in part taken from the idea of some email articles and things that were making the rounds at the time, and plenty of ideas of our own and our own experiences with players min-maxing and trying to bend the rules and all the rest of it. And weirdly, they took us up on that, and we wrote that in 99, and it was published in 2000 after a lot of revisions and editing. And yeah, I wouldn't take it back, but I would have asked for a better contract, because basically we've been stiffed out of all the residuals, all the derivative works and so on that came from that, such as the card game, which has basically kept Steve Jackson Games afloat up to this point. Yeah, I am bitter about it. I did explore legal remedies, but that contract we had was just terrible. But what are you going to do when it's your first contract in the industry? Well, if it was me, I would think of it as being the right thing to do, and I would have paid out a bit more to the creators and originators, but that's not SJG, and they're within their rights, so what can you do really other than grumble whenever you get the opportunity? So that was my first real professional work, which is why it's now 20 years since then. I didn't immediately capitalise on it, which is probably part of the reason I wasn't more involved in the development of Munchkin as a D20 product and then the card game, because unfortunately around that time I got a proper job for a few years, and that meant I was very busy. Between that and the LARP Society, yeah, I didn't have a lot of free time, and the money from freelancing in gaming didn't compare to a salary, or maintaining the friendship groups and so on that came with the LARP Society. So that's why I didn't capitalise more on it, I guess. But once I moved over to a separate department from tech support, I had a bit more free time, and was able to pursue some freelancing gigs. So I did some work for Mongoose Publishing, some various other companies, because this was during sort of the mid section of the kind of D20 gold rush. So there were lots of opportunities out there for both self-publishing and for freelancing for other companies, because that bubble would then burst not too much later, taking out almost as many people as the Magic bubble bursting did. I mean, Magic's still going, don't get me wrong, but there was a period of frenzy of making and selling card games that, when it deflated, took out a lot of hobby shops and a lot of publishers, unfortunately. Nearly killed Chaosium, which just kind of goes to show, I guess. Eventually I lost my job at that company, which several of my other friends worked in as well, because of embezzling by our boss, who made our department look bad and wasn't basically running it properly. But I'm not bitter. And So that basically. I began looking for more work, but this was just as the kind of .com bubble really imploded. So there just wasn't anything. I was overqualified or overexperienced for a lot of jobs, or underqualified or underexperienced for a lot of other jobs. I did apply for a whole bunch of weird stuff. There was one working for a monastery on the digitization and cleaning up of documents, which would have been really interesting. Unfortunately, I didn't get that one, and the pay wasn't that great either. Yeah, so I did odds and sods where I could, but there just wasn't any work. And as time dragged on, it became obvious that I'd have to do something myself if I was going to do anything. I think I spent 18 months on the dole, constantly looking for work and applying for anything and everything, and getting rejected from anything and everything, even shelf stacking. Well, you're not going to want to stay here and do that. You're not going to treat it as a career. No, because it's not a career, but I need money. Give me the work and I will do it. I will give you my labour in exchange for money. How about that? No. But eventually, yeah, it became obvious I'd have to do something myself, because after 18 months, or after a year, I think at least, they put you on these bullshit courses because they assume that the reason you can't get a job must be because you're a thickie. So I sat there in a class with smack addicts, drunks, guy who turned up with a knife and had to be arrested and escorted off premises. You know, in amongst these people, there was me, and there were a couple of other lads who actually had a brain in their head and didn't need to be there either. But we sat and we went through these courses, and I thought, I'm going to have to do something myself if this is going to end, because this is just pointless. So I got £500 seed money and started Postmortem Studios. Now originally, right, I'll establish some left-wing credentials here, but originally Postmortem Studios was meant to be run as a collective, or like a pirate ship, right? So you would contribute and you would get a share according to your contributions. Right? I didn't want to run it as a business. I wanted to run it as a cooperative. And I tried to encourage people to get involved and to write stuff and to do art and whatever else, so that we could put out projects together by bringing together some of my LARP mates at the time. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea, but very little of that actually translated to effort. And eventually it became obvious that it just wasn't possible to do it in the way that I wanted to do it. And I would instead have to run it as an actual business. So I did that, and you know, PDFs were really starting to take off at that point. So it was the right time to do it. And I put out my Adventure Seeds books, which still sell pretty well, and my other material. And I had this freedom to do things that I hadn't been able to do while freelancing. You know, Wizards is very exacting, pays good, relatively speaking, but you have to follow a whole bunch of rules, both explicit and implicit, and they're not exactly speedy about paying you. Mongoose reserved the right not to publish things that you'd written, and you got paid on publication, so if they didn't publish, you didn't get the money. You know, there were all these problems and clashes of personality and desire when it came to working for other people. So working for myself was a really, you know, big positive move for me, particularly because I could do things like Pentacle, or could pursue the license to reprint and update Blood and things like that. And that's incredibly liberating, and it's very hard to go back to working for someone else after you've done stuff for yourself. I mean, I've still done the odd spot of freelancing here and there, but overall I much prefer working for myself. Of course, there are restrictions now increasingly being imposed by payment providers or sales sites like DriveThruRPG. So a lot of the benefit of going it alone has gradually disappeared, which is why I've set up my own site for sale of my items, which is post-mort.com. So then around 2007, I got hit with depression. Looking back, I think I had depressive periods beforehand, but around this time It manifested as fatigue. I was just too tired to do anything, and I thought it must be chronic fatigue syndrome or ME or something. Test after test after test. I didn't want it to be depression. I didn't want to acknowledge there was depression. But eventually there was nothing left. They put me on some SSRIs and my mood elevated a bit. And ever since then I've been struggling with that and suicidal thoughts, and that's massively impacted my ability to work. And it's gotten more so over time. You have to understand, right, that at my peak I was capable of churning out as many as 10,000 words a day. And these days that's a real struggle, and I have to prioritize other things like looking after myself, monitoring my mood, doing various mental exercises and all the rest of it, just to stay relatively sane. So that was kind of just as my solo career was really picking up speed, I got slammed with that, and I've been struggling with it ever since. That hasn't stopped me getting involved in various industry slap fights, and it's kind of weird, but I think it reflects how weirdly extreme our society has gotten. I mean, I am so left-wing, I tried to run my company as a collective, right? And so anarchistic, I tried to run my company like a pirate ship. None of that took, not for want of trying, but still. And I've always been relatively progressive, but the line for me is artistic expression. That has to come first. Demonstrate your truth, create your art in the way that you want to. That's why being a self-publisher is such a big deal for me, and so important for me. But since about 2010, we've had this weird imposition of Puritanism, and it kind of blindsided me because it came from people who describe themselves as being on the political left, whereas prior it always came from the right, the evangelical right, the Reaganites. I mean, even though you can point at Tipper Gore and say Democrat, I mean, socially she was very conservative. So having that come from the left has really blindsided me. I'm an old school lefty, I guess. I hold free expression, free speech to be preeminent qualities. I believe artistic expression should be allowed up to the very limit of what's acceptable or tasteful or whatever else, even beyond the bounds of my own limits of taste and so on. And yet we have this atmosphere that is incredibly oppressive to creators and caustic to anyone who wants to create art or to be authentic or to allow work to speak for itself. You have to constantly apologize for every design choice that you make and so on. And so I'm getting accused of being right-wing and so on, while still being very much economically and socially progressive and very left-wing economically. And yet I'm getting this flack. It's very strange, it's very unnerving that free speech has become this supposed right-wing dog whistle or whatever it is. It's peculiar and sinister and counter to everything that I believe about left-wing politics, which is that it's about freedom, that it's about equality, that it's about fairness, and should be inherently anti-authoritarian, anti-hierarchical. And now we have these preachers of this new secular gospel, or whatever you want to call it, using immense social pressure to shut down people, which in my experience has tended to just shove them to the right. I don't know why I'm an exception. My views pretty much haven't changed. I moved very slightly towards the centre and then back again over the last few years, but that's about it. My reputation has suffered because, weirdly, I believe in equality and fairness, the process of justice, free expression. I haven't changed. What's changed is these people who call themselves on the left aren't. They're very socially conservative in their own way, small c conservative, and they use all this soft power to squash, to condemn, to corrupt the processes we have. And the mere act of standing up and saying, we should make sure this guy is guilty before we go after him, or I don't agree with what these people say, but they should be allowed to say it, that's now controversial. That's weird, and I don't get it. And this was already going on in 2010 or so, and then really hit ahead with Gamergate. Now, I was pro, if that can be said, so, because I was pro-transparency, against corruption, pro-free speech, pro-free expression, all of those things, which ended up bound up within Gamergate. And I didn't think that just because someone had a vagina, it meant they were automatically innocent, because I'm an egalitarian. Not that it was really much to do with Zoe Quinn or Anita Sarkeesian, save that they self-inserted themselves into it. This was in the computer game industry rather than the tabletop industry. But what we do seem to have uncovered there is that the press was massively corrupt. I mean, we always knew it was to an extent, but that corruption wasn't just from big companies paying them off or threatening to remove access, but it was also deeply tied into the indie scene there. That was concerning. And we've had our own problems in the tabletop industry with the larger companies attempting to use their muscle to censor or to silence others, or to have products removed, or to enact various forms of censorship. We've had our own issues there, and basically antitrust, but the business is so small there's not really any way to address it or to be compensated for it. And it's just utterly peculiar that standing up for other people's rights, whether it be a fair trial or just a fair shake in the court of public opinion, or not wanting people to be censored even if they have obnoxious and horrible views, that's somehow seen as right-wing. It's still bewildering. I still don't get it. I still don't understand how anyone who knows how strong my moral compass is, would think that I would get involved in Gamergate if it genuinely was a harassment movement. Of course, a lot of people who were otherwise apolitical have been led by the nose a little to the right by various people getting involved in it, but I think that's as much to do with the left or the conventional media condemning people out of hand without thinking, as it is to do with the Pied Piper of Breitbart or whatever else. It's still unfortunate. So that brings me to today, I guess. I'm still struggling with the depression. I have to do various things for self-care, and I'm not good with doing that. Like making videos, for example. I don't do it to make money off YouTube. I do it because it's somewhat therapeutic to talk to someone, even if it's just a camera. Because I live and I work fairly isolated, I don't see a lot of people. My reputation suffered a lot of harm, but I've always been true to myself. I've been authentic. This is this word that keeps coming up over and over again. People say they want authenticity. People say they want honesty. A lot of the time they don't. But by having this very strong moral compass, by being self-consciously authentic, I guess, by being honest, I seem to have gathered a core audience who can disagree, even angrily, without condemning me or cutting me off, and who value what I do as much because of who I am and because of those qualities that I have as anything else. But it's still a struggle. I've been trying to expand my repertoire and do other things, like video editing, sound editing, voiceover work. I'm looking to supplement what I do, but it's difficult, and the depression is a constant drag on that. And the online environment for a creator, whatever it is that you're creating, is unpredictable and increasingly hemmed in. If you sell books on Amazon, you might find yourself getting censored randomly or delisted or not showing up on searches just because there's a character on the front with a gun. Things like that. It's just absurd. There's the Chinese influence, there's the social justice activists kicking up a stink, often about nothing. There's the right-wing activists kicking up a stink, often about nothing. I was lucky enough to get into the industry at a point where if you were writing stories or making books or whatever, there was little to no barrier to entry, and that was both a good and a bad thing. And I was there to kind of cash in on that and make a name for myself or whatever. These days, it's a lot more piecemeal, it's a lot more difficult. You never know what rules exist or are going to be enforced, or where YouTube, for example, keeps pulling the rug out from under people. There's that unpredictability that exists today, and you never know whether you're going to draw the ire of another band of social justice activists acting like little petty authoritarians in the Red Guard, or right-wing activists, to be fair, increasingly calling you a degenerate or whatever else. And that's all not good for anxiety, shall we say, never knowing what's going to happen when you make anything or do anything. I think looking forward to the next year, it'll be continually about expanding my horizons, doing more things, doing other things, and also being more realistic about what I can accomplish. I'm still holding myself to that standard from before, when I was massively enthusiastic, a lot younger, and not depressed. And I shouldn't do that, because that leads to me beating myself up. I don't see myself ever stopping making games or stories of one kind or another. I just want to do it in more and different ways. Hopefully that can begin to happen. Zang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?
He said, Captain. I said, what? He said, Captain.